Recently, a client of mine reached out asking how they could compare budget versus actual with regards to their expenses in any given year. And the basic answer that I gave was that they could use XLOOKUP to compare the two tables as they notice what they had budgeted and what they were actually spending. But in the big picture, I would always solve this problem with Power Query and with pivot tables. And so in this video, what I'm going to show you is how I set it up so that you can pull in the latest budget data as well as the latest spend data, combine it together automatically, and then refresh it in a pivot table with a pivot chart so that you can see how the spending is progressing. So we're going to start today by looking into a folder system for a set of files that contain our spending data so far, and we're going to combine that together into the spreadsheet you see right here. So here's our overview. Right now, I have opened this file called the comparison document. We'll see this in just a second. It's basically my canvas. Also, in this folder is my current year budget. This is the spreadsheet called budgeted amounts. So I'm going to want to pull all the latest updated data about what we have budgeted. And then we have a folder here called expenses by month. And when I open it up, I can see that there are the expenses for January through May so far in here, each in their own individual files. And outside of that folder is a June file. So what I'm going to do in the very near future is I'm going to drag that June data into the folder and see that my report automatically updates and brings that in for part of the comparison. So let's see how that's all done with Power Query. As I said, I've got a blank canvas here inside of Excel, and the first thing I want to do is bring in all of my budget data. So to do this, I need to use Power Query, which you can find on the Data tab at the top of the screen. Go to the Get Data drop-down menu, and you'll see that Excel spreadsheets are one of many, many different data types that you could pull in from. Now, of course, most of us would have this in a combination of spreadsheets and CSV files and databases and all sorts of other places, but for today, we're just going to stick with Excel files. So I go to From File and From Excel Workbook here. I'm going to go to my desktop and find the Budgeted Amounts spreadsheet. So I click Import here, and basically I'll be able to look into that spreadsheet and see my table with all of my departments, account numbers, ID numbers, and budgeted amounts. Now, as I bring this data in, I have to ask myself the question, do I need to do something to clean this data up and prepare it? And secondly, how do I actually want to use this data table? Now, in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that I can click on Transform Data. This opens the Power Query editor, and it's exactly what I want to use right now. So my Power Query editor is open. I can see I've got a department column, account number column, item ID column, and this budgeted amount column, which is not currently recognized as a currency column. So I'll use the little 1, 2, 3 icon right here to choose currency as my data type. And you can see that my query is called Current Year Budget, or CY Budget. Now for right now, I think this is all I need to do. But now I get the question to myself, do I want to load this onto the page? I probably don't actually want to see the true budget data, so I'm going to go to my Home tab and click the Close and Load drop-down menu, where I can select Close and Load To, because I'm going to tell it just load it as a connection, don't drop it on the page at all. So I click on the radio button here, Only Create Connection, and I click OK. So I can see that, yes, this workbook now has all of the data from the current year budget. Next up, I need to get all those months of actual spending into my workbook as well. So I go back to the Data tab, go back to the Get Data drop-down menu, and this time, instead of querying it one workbook at a time, I notice that I can query entire folders at once. So I choose the From Folder option on the drop-down menu, and I again go in, find that data, and there's my folder called Expenses by Month. I click Open, and it tells me that the January through May data is in there, each one of them in their own spreadsheet file. And at the bottom, I'm going to tell it to combine those 5 different data tables together and allow me to do a transformation. Once again, the Power Query editor opens, and I'm able to decide what to do with that budget data. Here, once again, I'm going to go to my Home tab at the top of the screen, click the Close and Load drop-down menu and choose Close and Load To. And once again, load it only as a connection and click OK. So now my workbook has both the budget data and the expense data. And what I need to do is I need to find a way to merge these together and compare them against one another. So I'm going to reopen my Power Query editor. I'll just double click on Expenses by Month over here. Now, unlike XLOOKUP, I can't just tell Power Query to compare the department, account number, and item ID columns against the information that's in the budget. So what I've got to do is create an ID of some kind, a unique identifier, for each one of these budget items. So what I'll do is I'll click on the department column, hold down Shift, and click on the item ID column here. And on the Add Column tab at the top of the screen, you'll see there's a really easy button to use, which tells us that we can merge these columns together. And notice that this is not on the Transform tab, but rather on the Add Column tab. When we're using Power Query, you really need to differentiate between those things that take the columns you've got and change them, or those things that take the columns you have and add more columns to the data. So in this instance, we are adding a new column based on department, account number, and item ID by merging those together. So I click on Merge Columns, and I'm going to tell it to use a separator just for my own usefulness here. I'm going to choose a custom separator and put in a dash. And I can name this column anything I want. I'm going to call this one Budget Item ID. And then click OK. And so now I have this unique identifier value that I can use on my budget table. And of course, I'll go over here to Expenses by Month, and I'll do the same thing. Highlight from department through item ID, use the Add Column and the Merge Columns feature. Tell it to use the same dash delimiter, and I'll call this one Budget Item ID. So now in both data tables, I have a similar ID number to work with. Now, this next part is something you might not have thought of, which is to say that in each one of these instances, we have a department using an account number to pay for a specific item, but that may have been stretched across all 12 months in some different ways. And what we want to do here is we want to compile it all together. So I will use on the Transform tab at the top of the screen the button for Group By. This will allow me to group, of course, all my data together based on it having the same ID number. Ooh, let's make sure that total expense over here is a currency column. There we go. So what we'll do is we'll say if something has the same budget ID number, go ahead and total up the total expenses over here on the side. So I'll use Group By. I will tell it to group this by the column for budget ID. I'll call the new column that I'm going to create. So I'm going to add up by using the sum operation the total expense column. And the new column that I'm going to create is going to be called YTD expense. So I'm going to take this total expense column, and if there are two separate expenses for the same item within the same department using the same account number, we will add those together. And when I click OK, that does exactly that. It creates a simplified version of this table with the budget item ID number and how much we've spent on it so far. And over here on the current year budget, again, we've got the budget item ID number and the amount that we had budgeted to spend so far. All right, we're looking pretty good at this point. Now, what I actually want to be able to do is combine this together and then load that data into the Excel workbook. To do that, I need to figure out how to get a new table with the combined results of the budget and the expense. And the way I do that is by going to the Home tab at the top of the screen and finding the Merge Queries drop-down menu. So if something has the same ID number in both tables, we will be able to merge those two tables together, similarly to what VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, or index and match would have done. But now I don't want it to be inside this table, but instead make a new table out of those two merged queries. So I'll choose Merge Queries as new. I'll say that we have the current year budget as the top table and the expenses by month table as the bottom table. I'll say that budget item ID up here and budget item ID down here are the way that we match this. If we take just a second, it tells us that in the budget table, there are 257 rows. So there were 257 unique budget items there. And so far, the expenses by month have given us 172 of those matched. So that means that we still haven't put any money into a bunch of these other items. That's okay. We would expect that probably. About 85 items we haven't spent any money on so far. So we click OK, and a new merged query shows up over here called Merge 1. I'm going to double click here, and I'm going to call this one CY Budget V Actual. And you'll notice we have the budget item ID number, we have the department, the account number, the item ID, and the budgeted amount. And then lastly, right here at the end, we have this column called Expenses by Month. And right now it's just connected out to that other table. So we use the little expander button here and we say, okay, we don't need the budget item ID number because we've already got that. So I'll uncheck that checkbox, but we do need the YTD expense value. So I'll leave that checked here. Here, I'm going to go ahead and uncheck the checkbox for use column name as prefix because I don't think I need to see the words expenses by month before YTD expense. And I hit OK. And you'll notice here that a bunch of these do have numbers, but some of them have nulls because, once again, there are a bunch of budget items that we haven't spent any money on yet. So for our purposes here, let's go to the Transform tab at the top of the screen, and I'm just going to replace all those null values with zeros, just meaning we haven't spent any money yet. I'll click on Replace Values, and I'll replace null with 0, and hit OK. And let's just make sure that that's a currency column as well. So we have the budgeted amount next to the year-to-date amount of expense that we've paid out. And we probably want to take one more step here. Let's just figure out how far away we are, how much more budget we have remaining. So I will click on Budgeted Amount, hold down the Shift key and click on YTD Expense here. And on the Add Column tab at the top of the screen, there's a really easy button here for Standard. In other words, basic math, and I'll choose Subtract. So I click Subtract. Naming this column Subtraction is kind of silly. I will call this Remaining Budget. So we have each individual budgeted item. We have the amount that we had budgeted, the amount that we've spent on it so far, and the difference between those two numbers. and it's time to analyze that data. So let's go to the Home tab at the top of the screen, and this time around we'll hit Close and Load 2, but actually drop it into the workbook. So I'll leave it set to Table right here. I'll choose to load it into the existing worksheet in the cell C3, and I'll hit OK. And it'll just take a few seconds here to make this look better. I don't like the red, so I'll use my Table Styles drop-down menu and maybe choose a nice blue for the table. There we go. And I would prefer to see all of the budgeted amounts, all of the expenses, and all of the remaining budget as currencies. So I'll just select those columns, go to the Home tab, and turn them into currency amounts. But now what I need to do is I need to figure out how far along each of these different departments are, or maybe how far along each of the different accounts are towards the budgeted total. So I'm going to turn this into a pivot table, maybe even 2 pivot tables. I'll go to my Insert tab at the top of the screen and click the Pivot Table button. And I'll choose to load this into the existing worksheet right over here on the right, and click OK. And what I want is to break it down by department. So I'll take the department field and drag it into rows, giving me departments 410 through 422. Then I'll take the the budgeted amount and put that into the values field, and take the year-to-date expense and put that into the values field, going ahead and putting them side by side. And this is good, but we probably also want to visualize it. So let's go ahead and make this into a pivot chart. I'll go to my Pivot Table Analyze tab at the top of the screen and click on Pivot Chart. And the conventional choice here would be to have the actual and the budget next to each other. But we're going to tweak this a little bit. So I will go ahead and click OK to make a new pivot chart, and I'll click and drag that over to the side of my pivot table. You can resize this as much as you like. Now, I prefer not to have the gray buttons on my pivot chart, so I'm going to go to my Pivot Chart Analyze tab at the top of the screen and deselect the button that says Field Buttons on it. And now I think what I'll do is I will click onto the blue bars that are inside of this pivot chart, and I'll use the keyboard shortcut Control-1. This is one of my favorite shortcuts in Excel. It allows me to format whatever I have selected at the moment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the gap width needs to get a lot smaller. That makes these columns a lot less skinny. Let's take it down to 50%. But besides doing that, I'm also going to decide to overlap those bars on top of each other. By taking the series overlap up to 100%, you can now see that I've got a simple year-to-date expense on top of the budgeted amount. So now I'll just take those blue bars, and using the paint bucket on the right-hand side, I can choose whatever color I want for that. Let's go with a soft purple color. And then click on the orange bars, and I'll go with a darker purple color. So now we have the budgeted amount and the year-to-date expense on a departmental basis. Let's take a second and actually notate that. If I go to my Design tab at the top of the screen, I can click on Add Chart Element and add a chart title above the chart. And let's make sure that that chart title really talks about what the point of this chart is. So I will say year-to-date spending versus budget by department. And the last thing I like to do with these charts is to click on the outer edge of the chart and make sure that the border of that chart is set to be turned off. I prefer not to have that faint gray border on the outside part of the chart. There we go. So we've got our pivot chart, we've got our pivot table, and let's see what happens when things change from month to month. So right now, the current year-to-date expenses comes to $1.33 million. And all I have to do is come over here to the table that is the result of the query. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the June expenses into that folder and let go. And now that that has been put into that folder, I should be able to go to the Query tab at the top of the screen and hit refresh and get the new version of the data to come in here. And then as I scroll over here to the right, that $1.33 million worth of expenses, I'll click on the pivot table, come up here to the Analyze tab and refresh it. And now it says $1.48 million. And so the pivot table, the pivot chart, the table worth of data, all of that is dynamically updating month by month as our expenses come in.